Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys another catch-up review segment where I get to review some albums that have been recently released or released sometime this year, and for whatever reason I didn't have a chance to cover them in full and give them a proper album review, so instead I'm going to be talking about them here in this video pretty much. I got 3 projects I want to talk about here today, and these are all projects that came out in 2018. Some early year releases. January wasn't too busy a month when it came to album releases that I was super excited for, but I did go out of my way to listen to some new stuff or some things I otherwise wouldn't have really paid much attention to, and that's kind of where we end up here today. The first project I'm going to be talking about here in this video is the new Future album, The WIZRD. Now when it comes to Future, I wouldn't consider myself to be much of a big fan of his or really much of the more modern trap-influenced sound of hip-hop. It's just not a sound that I particularly care for all too much, but when it comes to Future, I think the guy, he's had some good tracks here and there, but I've never really cared for a full project much from him. I mostly checked out this album because, like I said before, there really wasn't all that much coming out in January that I was super excited to hear or check out, and I just decided, why not give this a listen, because, why not pretty much. I was hoping that maybe I'd be pleasantly surprised by this album, but unfortunately that's really not the case because this really just ended up being another Future album. If you've heard any of Future's albums before, for the most part, or any of his projects, you know what you're in for here on the WIZRD. My biggest complaint with the project really is just how samey so much of it sounds and how long this album runs for. There's not a lot of diversity between the different tracks here on this album. A lot of them just tend to blend together really nicely. And I'm sure for some fans of Future, that's going to be a positive thing. But for me personally, I really don't care for that. It just makes this entire album feel like one massive song. And when that one massive song is like an hour long, it better be a pretty interesting song. But unfortunately, that's not the case with the WIZRD. It's just like this hour-long chunk of very samey, very uninteresting, and very boring music. And also music that sounds like stuff that Future has already released before in the past, but much better before when he released it. There's a lot of songs on this album that also just feel kind of incomplete, or like there's like the basis for a song present, but it never really gets expanded to the point of being complete. I'm talking in particular tracks like Rocket Ship and Overdose, these tracks that are only like a couple minutes long, sometimes even less, and there's just not a whole lot to these songs. Like there starts to be a bit of something, but it never really goes anywhere or does anything that's all that interesting. And the fact that there's so many tracks on this thing that are so short and just feel really short on ideas as well, it just makes me wish that a lot of these shorter, more filler-like cuts were just completely cut out of the album in order to make this thing a bit more concise and shorter, because I really do feel like for the sound that Future goes for, that really hazy, trappy sound, I feel like it works best in a really short context, really. Like 30-40 minutes, I feel like that would be a perfectly adequate runtime for a Future album, and this is just way too long. There are some occasional moments on this album where things maybe are a bit more interesting than what you typically get here on this thing. The track Baptized is a pretty cool beat switch up that goes on in it. I really like the production in the second half of the track. I think it's pretty exciting overall. It's easily the best bit of production, at least to me, on the entire project. There's also a couple of tracks here on the album that have features on them that I think are also pretty standout, at least compared to the rest of the tracks. Though I do feel like the tracks on here that have features are mostly a bit standout from the rest in the album, mostly because the features give them something to, stand out compared to a lot of the rest of the tracks in here that just feel really similar to one another. The features themselves and the tracks overall aren't particularly interesting, more generally speaking, though. I mean, the Travis Scott feature just makes the track feel a bit more like a Travis Scott song, and then the track that features Young Thug and Gunna just, they definitely have a more interesting sound that they bring to the table to go along with Future's. However, unfortunately, the two of them have such similar sounds I could barely tell them apart, and that's not a particularly good thing, really, yeah. This album overall is one that just did not interest me all too much. I mean, you're going to like this album if you're a Future fan, if you like this very hazy, intoxicating trap atmosphere. then you're going to like this album at least to some extent. But if you've never been a fan of Future and you don't really care for that sound, this album isn't going to change your mind all too much. And like I said, there are some brief moments on this thing that are a bit more interesting than the rest of the project. However, they're not interesting in a way that makes me want to return to this album again, or even return to those moments individually again after listening to the album. They're just standouts on this thing because the rest of the album is as boring and uninteresting as it is. So yeah, overall I wasn't particularly interested in this project. I mean, the sound of it is pretty samey and uninteresting. The production also isn't particularly exciting either. There's just a lack of any interesting features as well. It's a pretty bland listen from start to finish. So yeah, wouldn't recommend this one to anyone unless you're already a pretty big fan of Future sound. Moving on though, let's talk about the second album that I want to review here today, the newest album from Malevolent Creation, The 13th Beast. This is the newest album from this old school death metal act, and one that I didn't get around to checking out initially just because this album slipped under my radar pretty much. But now that I've given this album several listens and, you know, a good amount of thought, there's not a whole lot I have to say about this album really at the end of the day. The best way I could describe this album to you and, you know, get you to convince you either to listen to it or not to listen to this album is that it's a pretty standard meat and potatoes old school death metal record with a bit of a more modern sound to it. If you like that sound a lot, then I think you'll like this record to some extent. If you don't like that sound, you won't like this record. I mean, it's pretty simple pretty much. Like the Future record I was just talking about, this album kind of reminds me of that album in the regard that it's pretty easy to sum up to someone what it sounds like pretty much. Now to me, I'm one of those people that while I like a lot of that old school death metal sound in records that came out in that time period, when it comes to more modern releases, I tend to like it more when artists are more willing to step out of their comfort zone and experiment with some different sounds, especially if they are older acts. I'm not really as much of a fan of when they're pretty much just, you know, doing the same thing over and over again from each album to the next. And that's pretty much what you get here on the 13th Beast. It's just a pretty standard old school death metal album. I feel like if the production on this thing wasn't as modern sounding, that this could have fit in rather nicely with what could have been released back when old school death metal, that sound was at its peak in the late 80s and the early 90s. However, this record just isn't as memorable or exciting as a lot of the best records of that time period, including records released from this very same band. All of the performances across this album are pretty fine, I would say. There's no moment on here where I really feel like anyone in the band is underperforming, and I don't really feel like the production hinders anything that goes on in this album either. It's a fine sounding album, and there are moments on this thing that I think overall are maybe even a bit above average. Probably my favorite track on the entire album is the song Agony for the Chosen, which features this very aggressive, snarling chorus that's also a bit catchy as well. I mean, as catchy as you're going to get on an old school death metal record. It's a pretty solid cut through and through. And throughout the rest of this record, there's also some nice guitar solos that pop up every so often, or a pretty enjoyable riff here or there. But these are just some occasional moments on the album that have a nice sound to them, really. None of these moments really invite me for repeated listens over and over again, because every time I finish listening to this album, despite the fact that it sounds pretty okay while I'm listening to it, I really don't have much of a desire to return to this thing. And if I am craving this sound, there's many other records out there that have a very similar sound but do it much better. Some of those records, mind you, as I said before, have been made by this very band that made this record that we're talking about now. Overall, like I said, this is an album that if you're a fan of that old school death metal sound and you could just eat anything up in that sound, you're going to enjoy this record, at least a little bit. But if you aren't a fan of that sound, either that or if you're a bit tired of it and you just like your bands to be doing more new or interesting things as they grow and evolve, kind of more like I do, then I don't really think this album is going to do all too much for you. And like I said before, all the performances on this thing are pretty okay from start to finish, but there's just really nothing new going on here on this record. It just kind of feels like the band is throwing out more and more of the same sound here on this record that many of their fans have probably already heard before, even from the band themselves, and done better too, as I've already said multiple times. So yeah, if you're a fan of old school death metal and you don't really mind the fact that this sounds a lot like a lot of other existing old school death metal, then check this out. But if you're more a fan of more unique sounding death metal, especially nowadays, I'm not sure if this will do a whole ton for you. Like I said, it's not a pain to listen to or anything, it's just average overall. And moving on, we're going to be talking about the final album I want to review here today, the newest from Swallow the Sun, When a Shadow is Forced into the Light. Now, this is a group that I wasn't familiar with prior to listening to this album. I mostly checked this out because I heard some positive things being said about it, and I wanted to hear some good music released in 2019, so I decided, why not check this out and give it a chance? I did go back and listen to the band's 2009 record as well. I don't remember the name of the album, but I thought it was decent overall, just to give myself some background knowledge on this group to some extent. But overall, I will say that, despite the fact that I don't have too much history with this group, I ended up quite enjoying this record a fair bit. Throughout this project, the group does maintain that death, doom, hybrid sound that apparently they've had throughout much of their work. Like I said, I can't speak from experience with the exception of their 2009 album, but online, based on what I've seen other people saying, that tends to be the common sound that this group has had going for them. However, this album is a bit of a departure for the group as it features more clean vocals. Once again, apparently that is the case based on stuff I've seen online. I can't speak with too much experience there, but I quite like the fact that there's a lot of clean vocals on this thing. I like the fact that the death growls are used a lot more sparingly throughout this project's run. I think the clean vocals throughout this album sound really great. They have a lot of emotion to them as well, and they're able to convey a lot of the very sad themes that just permeate this album rather nicely. And I do like when they mix things up and add the death growls in as well. Like I said, they're used very sparingly, but when they do come in, they do make a really great impact, and they are a nice change of pace in the project. Much of the instrumentation throughout this project also carries a very doomy feel that pairs up really nicely, once again, with the overall sad atmosphere of this project. This album is permeated with themes of loss and sadness, and it just works really nicely, like I said, with the vocals across this thing and the instrumentation. Just the overall vibe of this album is incredibly sad, and the death, doom, metal hybrid approach to the sound on this thing works really well with being able to, share those emotions in a way that's both interesting, but at the same time really sad and emotional as well. So yeah, overall I was a pretty big fan of the vocals throughout this thing, the overall atmosphere, the lyrics were all pretty great across this project. I do have some complaints with this album, however, most notably while I do like the general vibe of a lot of the instrumentation on this project, some of it at times can feel kinda uninteresting or it can kinda blend together. It's just not the most interesting or ear-catching as I, maybe would have hoped that it would be. I do think all the instrumentation on this album is really nicely composed, and it sounds okay, fine enough, but at times, like I said, it is just a little bit underwhelming, and I definitely feel like the vocals and just the overall lyrics and themes and atmosphere of this thing are what's carrying the project more so than the instrumentation. But overall, despite that minor complaint, I still did rather enjoy this album. I think it's a pretty solid metal album, and one that if you're a fan of doom metal or death doom hybrid, then I think you'll like this, at least to some extent. Yeah, I enjoyed this album a fair bit. Definitely my favorite album out of all the ones I'm talking about here today, and one that you should have on your radar, like I said, if you're a metal fan. So yeah, I would recommend this one. And with that said, that concludes this video today. This is all just my personal opinion. If you happen to disagree with my thoughts on either of these three albums, that is perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your opinions on these albums, regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with me, in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, countdown list, all that good music-related stuff. So if you want to see more of that, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.